this kind of modern slogan of if it floats your boat and doesn't hurt anyone, do it. It a lot of, like you mentioned, a lot of those cultural pressures that helped people grow, develop, whatever, aren't there, or they're there in a different way. And I think when a new temptation, when a new struggle comes up, it always seems like the biggest deal. But if you look at the history, just look at history, every era, every age, every generation has had its struggles. Some of those struggles have more or less been the same since time immemorial. Some of them are unique to that age or to that generation. And I think we have to be aware, attentive for these new temptations coming at us. We may have cell phones now that can consume massive quantities of our time in vain pursuits. But 100 years ago, in the Soviet Union, Christianity was made illegal. There were persecutions. You know, we may deal with the temptations of cell phones today, but 2,000 years ago, it was the temptation of idols. I think there's always been difficulties, so to say. But again, we also have examples of holiness in the midst of all these, right? You know, we have the saints, those early martyrs who refused to sacrifice to the idols, refused to participate in the pagan festivals. We have innumerable martyrs of the Ottoman yoke under the Soviet Union. Stories and accounts of people facing those modern day temptations. So I maybe that doesn't answer your question, but I think sometimes when we start to think things have never been as bad as they are today, and we start listing off everything going on, we're moving ourselves into almost in the direction of hopelessness or despair, or somehow, if I had lived in the time of, Saint Gregory Palamas, I would have, achieved something spiritually. But that's not the case. So I'm sorry if that doesn't answer the question. Do you see what I'm saying?
No, but I do see what you're saying. I mean, I know, but I think you actually deepened the question in a way, because if I understand what you're saying is that you're saying that this struggle has presented itself and shifted throughout history. So the struggle that we may be facing now may be different, but it doesn't mean that it's any, maybe any harder or any easier than what was in the past, so to speak, right? So it's sort of like every generation will face its own set of difficulties that are, I guess, sort of like, I guess, built for that particular generation, right? But then again, but you do raise an interesting point, right? Because how many of us in the modern era, with the convenience that we have, with all of the ease of life that we have, could have survived a situation like that? You know what I mean? Because I think maybe to some degree we may be weaker in some ways. Or do you think maybe that's not a good way to think about it? Because, for example, I'll read some of the Russian version of World War II, right? Of the for example, of the invasion of Leningrad, right? And how people fought to the death to defend their homeland. And something that we're not really taught here in the West is the struggle that a lot of Christians faced in the East during the communist regime. So I don't know if there's a lot of people in the modern era that would be able to survive that, or maybe that the situation, the difficulty builds the saints in a way. All right, I don't know how to come to terms with that, because society seems a lot weaker in some ways than
Mhm.
those individuals. So I'm not entirely sure how to go about that.
Yeah. I remember I was on Mount Athos at a monastery, and I was talking to a monk who happened to have grown up here, in the United States, and I don't remember exactly the context of the conversation, but something he told me that kind of stood out to me was that the elder, the Yerunda of this monastery, had said to him, or in a synaxis, a gathering of the brothers, that they as monks could not fast the way that their grandparents did. That literally they physically could not survive fasting the way that that earlier generation of faithful Orthodox Christians in Greece fasted. So I certainly, yes, there's certainly with industrialization, with the rise of commercial society, I mean, this is the first time in human history where homelessness has to struggle with the disease of obesity.
Right.
Right. So there's certainly a weakening in that sense. How quickly would we as modern 21st century people in the West, how quickly would we fold, would we break underneath the threat of losing the food to feed our children that was exerted on, Christians in the early part of the Soviet Union? I don't think I would hold up very well. But at the same time, I remember I had a few friends when I was younger whose parents didn't let them watch TV, right? They didn't have a TV in their home. And whenever these kids would go to a house where there was a TV, they would get 2 inches from that screen, they wouldn't blink, and they'd be, completely mesmerized. They'd be unable to, they wouldn't know how to deal with it. And I think maybe it's like that. Maybe if we took someone who was alive 200 years ago and they saw, this technology that we have, would they be able to, turn off the TV to sit down and have dinner with their family like we do today? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because that's not a temptation, a struggle that they've had to deal with, right? Most of us have not had to deal with hunger, with persecution, with these things that happened in the past. So again, I think we just have to do what we can to recognize these are the temptations. This is where we're at in today's world. This is what we struggle with.